what I would like to do today actually is to present you a really work in progress talk. I thought that it would be, yeah, the best occasion to receive feedback from you. So as Manuel said, my work now is basically in the philosophy of medicine. And so usually I do applied conceptual engineering actually. And but today I decided to look at what I think is, well, the meta theory or the fundamentals of conceptual engineering. And so it's really some kind of unusual work for me, but it really also connects with what I did in my past part of my career when I actually reflected on concepts and on these more general issues. So what I would like to argue for today, and hopefully in what I will write when I receive your feedback. People employ concepts in very complex social practices, and I suggest that we might call them language games, following Ludwig Wittgenstein in philosophical investigation. These language games are characterized by rules, which can be explicit or implicit. And what is interesting about language games is that they are different in many respects that we will see in what follows at the end of the talk, and on many dimensions. And also their rules are very different. And I suggest that conceptual engineering should be aimed at, well, changing the rules of specific games. That should be the aim of conceptual engineering. And I think that this position amounts to pluralism about implementation strategies with respect to the framework of conceptual engineering. And maybe I'm also pluralist in other respect too. Okay, so what I will do specifically in this talk, first I will say what are concepts according to me, whether it's better to go on for the psychological or for the semantic notion of concepts. And I will also say something about the distinction between concepts and conceptions. And then I will move to language games and variety, just to sketch how it might go. And I will say that in these language games, experts play different roles. And I will give you just mentioning 2 short examples. And then I will sort of finish by telling you where I locate myself with respect to conceptual engineering's questions and challenges. Sorry for the typos that I might have left in my slides. So what are concepts? I think that psychological concepts can be described as a functional kind. This is some old work that I did back in 2010, but I think these ideas have been articulated by many other people, and for example by Manuel Gustavo Isaac in one of the his latest papers. So in the context of when I had this sort of idea was in the context of the discussion of Edouard Marcheri's book, Doing Without Concepts. And he said in that book that maybe we can do without the notion of concept in psychology, because it's a very murky notion. It's too he had some arguments that he's not keen on presenting anymore. But he said basically concepts are those bodies of knowledge that are used by default in the processes underlying the higher cognitive competencies. And I said, well, yes, but also concepts can be described not just what is used by default, but can be described, but what they can do, characterized as those bodies of knowledge that can perform a double function, namely as abstraction and projection of knowledge, and also that are able to be recombined almost freely in order to form more complex concepts and thoughts. And so they are functional kinds. Examples of non-mental functional kinds are, for example, vehicles and food. And the essence, the nature of a mental functional kind is to bring about some outcome or to exercise some capacity. And this is what concepts have in common. So what are the functions of concepts? Abstraction is the bottom-up process of extracting information from a single encounter with an object over property instance, and then generalizing such information to all encounters with that object of property. This is one core function that concepts are called to perform. And then we have category induction, which is the complementary top-down process of projecting such knowledge to new encounters. So, for example, when I see a thermometer, it's a new example, but I know how to use it, and I know what is it for, and so on and so forth. These functional properties of concepts, they provide constraints on what may count as an adequate concept realizer in our mind. So many candidates are available, for example, prototypes, definitions, examples, theories, and also sensory motor contextual representations. So I'm here reminding you of all the tradition of the psychology of concepts from Eleanor Roche, or, for example, Barsalou, and also, of course, the classical view of concepts as this definition. So if we think that concepts just are individuated as functional kinds, then whatever can perform that function can be a good concept realizer. So we are free to assume the mental structure we want to have. Constraints may come from the task at issue, from the conceptual domain, from levels of expertise, and so on and so forth. But this is the psychological view of concepts. But also there's the semantic view of concepts. And on this view, and the two views are usually presented as alternatives. So either you go psychologically or you go semantically with concepts. The semantic concept of X is a structured definition of X with individually necessary and collectively sufficient components. It is not a kind of mental representation, but is usually thought about as an abstract object. And it is semantic because it is reference fixing. It specifies what counts as being an X. So, for example, when we have the concept of a square, we know that a square, we say that a square is a plane figure with four sides and four angles. Angles are same size and also the same size of each. I can't find the word. So if we think about the question of what is the object of conceptual engineering, this is a question that appeared in the context of the discussion of the method of conceptual engineering. These two ways, the psychological way and the semantic way, have the pros and cons, the good and bad. of each. So what's good about psychological concepts? Well, psychological concepts are causally efficacious. I mean, psychological concepts make us reason, categorize, act, pick up things. And yes, we know that the actions and the thoughts we perform and execute are causally somehow enabled by concepts as psychological entities. And also psychological concepts, they don't have a spooky metaphysics. They are just kinds of mental entities. They can be studied by empirical research, but also psychological concepts have some bad aspects with respect to the project of doing conceptual engineering. Well, it is not easy to find what counts as similar concepts. Similarity metrics are difficult to study for them. And yes, they can be studied by empirical research, but empirical research is difficult. I mean, how are we to well, there are very different ways of individuating what is the psychological concept of whatever category, and these different ways can lead, and they also do lead to different results. And it is not easy to intervene on them, meaning that, for example, there's a recent paper by Edouard Machiry, which says that in some cases, psychological concepts are just, too natural to go away. They're just really entrenched in how the mind works, because of their, sometimes evolutionary reasons. Sometimes there are empirical reasons why they can be really resistant to interventions. And okay, so let's consider semantic concepts. So why it can be nice and easy to have semantic concepts as object of conceptual engineering. Well, it's easy to account for their publicity. They are explicit, definitional, and also they're not in any particular person's mind, but they are like at anyone's disposal. They can be grasped by ideally by each of us. And to some extent, it is easier to intervene on them because components are just neat and tidy. So if we wanted to, change the concept of working week, let's say working week is composed of 3 days and not 5 days. Okay, we have an explicit concept of working week, and then we go on and try to intervene on it. Okay, but what is bad about semantic concepts? Well, they have a spooky metaphysics. And if we talk about abstract entities, then it is difficult to see exactly where they are located in the world. And also, apparently, philosophers can't find them, meaning that conceptual analysis is not a really successful enterprise in the history of philosophy. Oh, this is a very common objection to the semantic idea of concepts. I also endorse concept externalism, however. What is concept externalism? It is the idea that psychological concepts are individuated by what they are concepts of. So, for example, my concept of a common cold and my doctor's concept of a common cold can both be concepts of a common cold, in spite of how different they can be. And semantic concepts are individuated by what they are concept of too. So, this is possibly a link between the psychology of concept and the semantics the semantical view of concepts. What I tentatively think is that the semantic concept of X, at least in some cases, can be described as, sorry, not in some cases, usually can be described as the psychological concept of the ideal knower of X. So if there were an ideal knower of apples, then the semantic concept of an apple would be the psychological concept of that in ideal knower, which is thereby able to fix reference, know the truth about apples, fix the boundaries of the category, and everything we want to have from a semantic concept. And also the ideal knower knows all the components of X if X is a composite concept and not a primitive concept. And yes, the ideal knower applies the concept of X to all and only X's. And well, usually we are moved by the objection that ideal knowers don't exist, and they are like angels. Angels don't exist. But here's a suggestion that I think might be helpful, at least in some domains. Angels don't exist, but explicitly defined concepts do exist. Stipulated concept, for example, is a concept whose definition is explicitly agreed upon by members of a community, typically in science, in law, and in philosophy. Most of the times, people who fix the definition are the experts in the relevant domain. And in that case, experts are ideal knowers. So they're not really angels, but just like angels, they do all the reference fixing, category boundaries, and all the what semantic concepts do. Actually, this is my tentative of connecting the conceptual, the psychological view of concepts with the semantic view of concepts. With experts concepts, we have some of the functions of semantic concepts performed by sort of a psychological concept, let's say. Still going on with the fundamentals, so what I think about concepts and basics. So I think the notion of conception can be useful in the project of conceptual engineering in many cases. What are conceptions? This is a notion that didn't really receive a lot of attention from psycholinguistics. There are some writings by a couple of articles by George Ray and Peacock. Christopher Peacock also talked about conceptions in his later, not in a study of concepts, but in later articles, 1998. But conceptions are used in, for example, political philosophy, in other applied domains. For example, Rawls talks about different conceptions of justice, where different conceptions are different specifications of a general concept of justice. So in one sense, conceptions are what specify a general concept. And conceptions can also be states of incomplete mastery of a concept. For example, I do think I have an incomplete concept of big data. I know something about them, and I know how to find information, but generally I don't think I can give a paper on what big data are at the moment. And I think there are people who have the complete concept, which I defer to. And yes, this distinction easily applies when explicitly defined concept can be found. when a concept is explicitly defined, for example, in a scientific domain, or in a highly specialized domain, then conceptions as incomplete states of mastery can make sense. In these cases, we then say that lay people have conceptions and experts have concepts. Or maybe we can also say that different experts' conceptions compete. For example, we might have the example of, let's say, mental disorders. There are many experts of mental disorders. Let's say, let's focus on a particular mental disorder, could be major depression. Then you can have a psychiatrist who has a biological conception of major depression, major depressive disorder, and whereas clinically trained psychologists might have a dynamic conception of this kind of disorder, whereas maybe they could converge on basic symptoms. So the idea is that conceptions can be rivals with respect to how a category is thought about. Okay, so this is about concepts and conceptions. So coming to what could be my, let's say, original proposal here, I think we might usually usefully introduce the notion of language game in the context of conceptual engineering. I would like to borrow the label language game in order to name the different kind of activities and practices where concepts are employed. The notion, as you all know, comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein, who introduced the concept of language game in his sort of so-called later period, for example, in his philosophical investigations. So, of course, I do not mean to engage in any scholarly work on Wittgenstein. So when I use language game, I really mean language game star, which stands for a modified version suitable for our purposes. Here the term language game is meant to bring into prominence just the fact that the speaking of language is part of an activity or a form of life. This is Wittgenstein from Philosophical Investigation, paragraph 23. And Wittgenstein also wrote that concepts stand in the middle of our lives. You know that Wittgenstein had a beautiful style of writing, which was like sketchy-like, and he had very short remarks, and he didn't really like clear and neat and tidy definitions, not at all. But these ideas are enough for what we need to say, meaning that what I wanted to say is that there are different activities involving concepts. These activities are not just linguistic, they are part of our social practices, our cultural practices, our nature. And concepts stand in the middle of our lives, meaning that it's not just a question of explicitly seeing them in vocabularies, but they are constrained in the very the social structure in which we live. Suggestions from Wittgenstein, more of that. There is a plurality of language games. The plurality is on many dimensions, for example, simplicity, complexity, structure, non-structure. Wittgenstein likes examples, so I would go with examples myself. For example, the game of using language at the fruit market, the game of talking about one's pain. When for example, I go to the doctor and say, how's the cold going? And I say, well, the cold is all right, almost, but I have some pain here in the upper, the upper part of my nose. It's like, okay. The game of mathematics, in which, yes, of course, concepts are implicitly defined, but precisely defined nonetheless. Language games are embedded in our form of life, meaning that they are not arbitrary. The interesting sense of language games that can be helpful in our context is that in order to change them, we cannot just say, let's fix other rules, right? They are embedded in practices. They are also, they are regulated by a grammar, according to Wittgenstein. And this grammar is a very complex idea in the Wittgensteinian writings, but basically it is a system of either implicit or explicit rules. Some of the rules are taught just by living inside a certain environment and living inside a certain practice, where some other rules are more explicit, for example, when you learn some parts of mathematics. Linguistic games are not essentially linguistic. For example, when you go and buy fruit at the market and groceries, okay, it's not just about knowing the meaning of the various kinds of fruits and vegetables, but also you know that the language games involves the fact that you have to ask for the price, give money, thank the person, or wait for your turn if people are queuing at the shop. So they are really sort of complex activities involving many factors. Elaborating on that, if we go back to what I sketched before, suggested before, we might surely say that some linguistic games do involve explicitly defined concepts. For example, here we are playing, I think we are living into a linguistic games in which we like having explicitly defined concepts. For example, the concept of conceptual engineering, or the concept of concept, and so on and so forth. The linguistic game we are playing at the moment is a game in which, yes, it is possible and desirable to have explicitly defined concepts, and most are. But some linguistic concepts just don't have, some linguistic games just don't have explicitly defined concepts. They just have psychological concepts all the way down, and these are really, they can be really different from one person to the other person. And also the same concept can be explicitly defined and non-explicitly defined when it is used in different language games. Very basic example is the example of the same, let's say an apple or a flower that can be non-defined prototype-based concepts for many of us, where when we play, when we are engaged in many games, for example, I don't need a botanical definition of an apple in order to buy apples at the grocery store. I just need, I don't know, examples of them, exemplars of an apple. Well, apple is a very familiar concept, so maybe I know a lot about apples, but in order to have concepts of fruits that I can use at the market, I barely need exemplar-based concept. So, for example, I can spot sort of pear-shaped big object at the market and say, oh, well, okay, I've seen another of those before and they were quite good, so I'll have another, I buy one today. So but the same category can be explicitly defined by in a scientific context where there's a taxonomy in which this category has a proper definition or characterization. So, and also some linguistic games involve deference, meaning that it is part of the rule of the game that some people are less competent, so the very content of their concept has a sort of pointer to other people's concept of the same thing. For example, my example was that big data. I know that I don't know much of that about big data. I know some things, but I know where to find plausible, good knowledge about big data. And so I defer to experts. I know scientists who wrote on those. I know philosophers. I also know that there's Wikipedia. And when I talk about things when I talk about big data in certain contexts, I do defer, because I realize it is important that I employ a concept knowing that it is incomplete. Whereas, to go back to the market example, I don't, in the linguistic game of buying fruit at the market, in that specific respect, I do not defer to the botanical concept of, let's say, artichoke or mango. I just use my old one. So deference is not part of the rules of the game. When I go to the doctor, definitely I do defer. And I defer because of the difference of expertise in. So let's imagine, try to think about different language games involving concepts, and just to think about how these different aspects can manifest in different games. The language game of talking about toothaches. This is something Wittgenstein wrote about, as you might know. We don't differ about our concept of pain, but we do differ. We do differ about the cures of toothaches. The language game of going to the market to buy groceries, the language game of discussing what conceptual engineering is, the language game of establishing the definition of mental disorder for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's also the language game of obesity research, in which people employ the concept of obesity in order to discover facts about the determinants of obesity, models to explain how obesity happens, and of course different level of explanation of the phenomenon of obesity. But also the language game of talking about people's weight and appearance, in which the concept of obesity can be employed. For example, teenagers talking about actors in a series and say, oh, that guy's really obese. So different concept language games can involve apparently the same concept, but the rules of these games and also in the deep structure of these games can be very different. So let me come to the rules of the game, which I said could be the object of our conceptual engineering activity. Rules, so if we have this idea of concepts involving various language games and the idea of language games conceived as practices, social practices, real practices involving people, rules can really vary from explicit to implicit. Conceptual definitions may vary from really explicit, as in scientific concept, in law concept, and absolutely implicit. Knowledge structure may vary from hierarchical knowledge structure, in which some people know a lot and other people know a little bit less, and then people who just, heard of it. And some other language games have a horizontal knowledge structure. For example, well, I guess when we talk about our experiences in friendship, or experiences in about when we talk about what we did last weekend, well, we're sort of experts on most of what we talk about. And for also, everyone is a super expert about things about themselves. And also, yeah, and I said before, deference rules apply or do not apply. This varies a lot. And also, I think philosophers' entitlement in changing rules may vary from complete to none. Complete, well, let's say, if this is a language game in which we are discussing, well, the game of giving and presenting reasons for various for doing conceptual engineering, and reasons for some ways to conceive the conceptual engineering project. Well, here, philosophers' entitlement in changing rules, it's top. I mean, we are those who are professionally entitled in changing rules of our game. That is absolutely no problem. In other cases, it is really more subtle to exactly pin down what the role of philosophers can be, and also what it should be. So both in terms of efficacy and in terms of entitlement. Are we entitled to sort of try to change the rules of the games in medicine? This is something I often think about myself. Well, it depends. There are conceptual parts of scientific research in medicine which call for a philosopher's contribution, and while some others just don't. Let me go to the main point then. What is conceptual engineering? Here are two definitions. Characterizations. Manuel Gustavo Isaac wrote recently, the method of assessing and improving our concepts. And another very recent paper, the attempt to create new representational devices or to modify existing representational devices. This is definitely from a psychological idea of concepts. And conceptual engineering usually has an ameliorative bent, meaning that the goal is to create better representational devices than the existing ones. So, okay, what is my idea here? I think very simply, we might view conceptual engineering as changing the rules of a specific game. Suppose our target is to ameliorate the concept of X. So then the first step would be to ask ourselves where it is used, the concept of X, where it is employed. Let's say we are interested in the concept of X as employed in this specific language game. For example, we are interested in making the concept of obesity better in the field, in the language game of obesity research. And then we're going to go on and ask, how is the language game structured? In this language game, is that an explicitly defined concept? Then what we're going to do is try to change an explicit rule. So we will confront the experts' concept or competing conceptions that experts have. Or for example, it might be that we think that experts have a bad concept that should be substituted, and so our aim is to substitute the lay people's concept to the expert's concept. And then what we're going to do first is actually also to change the deference rule. So we're going to restructure. We have to restructure the linguistic game, the language game, so that people do not defer to that concept anymore. And also, we have to substitute the explicitly defined expert concept is, if there is one. Or suppose that we don't have expert concepts in that domain, and people just go on with a horizontal distribution of knowledge. Then, of course, what we have, not of course, but presumably, what we have to change is rather practices. So by giving examples of how to use a concept and how not to use it. So, for example, we want to change the concept of obesity in the linguistic games, or in the linguistic game of describing people appearance in informal settings. Then we want to discourage people from using obesity with derogatory meaning. And then what we need to do is to give examples of other ways to characterize overweight people, or maybe to explicitly find good examples of successful people who are very overweight, in order to try to disentangle the derogatory meaning from obesity. So in this case, with no explicit concept at hand, what we need to change in the rules of the game is different from what we need to change in a language game with explicit rules. So this has some bearing on the feasibility question of conceptual engineering, I think. Feasibility questions are about whether and how conceptual engineering, defined one way or another, can be put into practice. Well, maybe it also has to do with the control challenge, but yeah, here I took just this characterization. But so, is changing the rule of the game feasible? Well, and my answer will be, it really depends on the game and its rules. I have the I suspect that games with explicit rules are easier to intervene on. So practices in which we have explicitly defined concepts are practices on which the conceptual engineering work can be done in more straightforwardly. But then it depends on, well, the success is really up to empirical considerations. Sometimes when we don't have explicit concepts, then the way to move towards a different concept could be empowering people with the different information so that they develop different concepts themselves. And this is another kind of route to feasibility. So definitely, what I would like to say, in fact, about feasibility is a no answer, meaning that it depends on how the language game is structured, and feasibility crucially depends on that. So examples I won't describe because I know it's late, and I knew it would have been late at this time of the talk. One example, actually, I think you already encountered it because it was presented by Rachel Cooper in a previous talk in this series last year. And this is a great example, according to me. So you know that until the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder. So it was in the manual, in the nosology. But then what happened in the task force of experts that were in charge of compiling the new manual, so they realized that both empirical evidence and people's ideas, people's feelings, people's experiences about homosexuality had changed, and they had moved away from the idea that homosexuality is a disease to be cured. So what they had to do was to make it possible that homosexuality was no more a disease into the nosology. And the way to do that was to propose and to approve a new definition of mental disorder, so that according to the new definition, homosexuality was not a disorder anymore. And in the new definition that was introduced included a harm requirement. So the new definition, which is basically the one that is still on in the manual now, is that a mental disorder is corresponds to some kind of functional dysfunction on systems, affective or cognitive systems in the individual, but it also needs to include harm to the person. Harm meaning distress or disability to the individual. And there is no way of arguing that homosexuality per se causes distress or disability to the individual. So at least for that, it can be definitely excluded from nosology of mental disorder. So here we have an example of changing the rules of the game in a very straightforward manner. That is, okay, there's this definition. This definition has these unwanted consequences. So we change. So it was actually a failure in the extension of the concept of mental disorder that was found. And the solution was to change the rules of the game by creating a task force of experts that created a stipulated, proposed a new definition of the concept of mental disorder, so that the unwanted referential effect wouldn't happen anymore. And this is an example in which it is conceptual engineering. It is a top-down example of conceptual engineering that involved changing the rules of the game, which in this case were completely explicit. Examples I won't describe. I mentioned it, changing the concept of obesity with the aim of destigmatizing obese people in the media. So in this case, what we want to do is to cancel out the the implication of, well, the possibility of inferring this person is obese from the premise this person is obese to the premise this person is weak, or this person is culpable, or this person is inept, or not able to not able to perform social roles and functions. And in order to cancel these implications, we need to either to put more, I don't know, positive stuff into people's perception of obese examples, or somehow to to empower the obese people so that to empower people so that they know more about obesity as a condition that does not involve the weakness of the will. Whereas if we want to change the concept of obesity with the aim of enabling medical research on obesity as a physical condition, then we would need to stress the fact that obesity is a risky condition for health. So it is a disease in the sense of a condition that limits the chance of having a long life, basically. So this case is a case where the same concept is embedded in very different language games, in which, social structure, explicitness of rules, and so on and so forth are really different. And also, it might be that the involvement of philosophers is different in these different games. So also the entitled, I finished my time, is a word where conceptual engineering is a better word. Are philosophers entitled to engineer concepts? Well, yes, maybe not. Maybe, I don't know. It really depends on the language game we are talking about, and also how it is structured, and not just doesn't just depend on the concept we are thinking of. So what I had sort of sketched is a pluralism about implementation strategies. It might also be a pluralism about concepts, because I said that depending to the language game, concepts are more on resembling the psychological view of concepts, or rather they approaching the semantic view, where for semantic view I intend the middle ground semantic view, where the semantic concept is actually the psychological concept of the experts. And also I think I also pointed to pluralism about entitlement, because really it has to be earned on the specific ground of the specific language game. Okay, so that's all. Thank you very much.